Kia ora, Istanbul, and Pacific greetings to all of you. It's nice and sunny here in Christchurch, New Zealand, where the University of Canterbury is located. On behalf of the Macmillan Brown Centre for Pacific Studies and, of course, the Pacific Regional Security Hub, which is hosting this particular seminar, I'd like to welcome all of you, wherever you are, what time of the day or night it is, whether it's in Europe or Asia, Middle East or Africa, the United States, the Americas, and the Pacific, of course, New Zealand and Australia. Welcome, Nisambula Vinaka. Today we're going to have a very interesting discussion around the changing U.S. dynamics and relationship with the Pacific. And we have two very, very prominent experts in this particular area. And of course, as we've seen in the last few years, there have been different phases of transformation in the Pacific in terms of the geostrategic dynamics. At the time of the Cold War, we may say the phase one since World War II, and then there was a phase during the War on Terror, which also had a lot of implications in terms of Pacific geopolitics. And the phase three, I suppose, we're looking at the China and the West contestation, which is still, in many ways, still happening at this point in time. And then now we're looking at, I suppose, the fourth phase, where there's a lot of dramatic changes in the geopolitical dynamics in the Pacific, with what some writers have referred to as the Trump 2.0 era. It's very significant because there have been a number of things happening in terms of the changes in the multilateral dynamics and system as well, and the U.S. relationship with countries around the world, certainly in the Pacific. There have been a lot of changes in terms of trade, in tariffs, and diplomatic relationship as well. So a lot of those things are happening right now. And one of the reasons why we have this particular seminar to explore in some detail some of the changes taking place in the Pacific. And the two experts we have today are from the North Pacific, from Micronesia. And that's deliberate because of the close connection between the United States and the Micronesian territories, and where the U.S. has been actively involved, particularly in case of Guam, where the U.S. military interest is quite significant. And often a lot of the discussions around the Pacific centers around the South Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, the South Pacific, and so forth. And I think it's very, very important that we hear from our relatives in the North, because they're directly impacted by the changes in the U.S. policy in the Pacific. So I'd like to introduce both of them. The first one is Associate Professor Kenneth Kuper, who is the Associate Professor of Political Science and Micronesian Studies at the University of Guam, where he serves as a research professor at the Micronesian Area Research Center focusing on geopolitics and international relations. And he's also director of the Guam-based organization, Pacific Center for Island Security, which provides an island and islander perspective on geopolitical developments in the Pacific Islands region. Kuper sits on the Government of Guam's Commission on Decolonization, as a very, very significant commission indeed, and has authored the most comprehensive study on Guam's future political status options to date. He's also a fellow of the Pacific Academy of Sciences. He was recently appointed a fellow. Congratulations to you for that, Ken. And also a visiting fellow of the Pacific Regional Security Hub, and a 2025 Obama Foundation Asia Pacific leader. So it's a very significant award that is received. And the second speaker after Ken would be Mary Hattori, who's an associate professor. She's based in Hawaii, originally Chamorro born and raised on the island of Guam, which is Guam, So Mary holds a Doctor of Education, is one of 9 children born to Femina Perez and Paul Hattori of the clan Familian Titang. She's an affiliate graduate faculty with the University of Hawaii in Manoa and Chaminade University of Honolulu in the fields of educational leadership, educational technologies, indigenous leadership, indigenous research, and Pacific Island studies. Mary has been a resident of Hawaii since 1983 and is author, community organizer, poet, public speaker, consultant with a passion for empowering Pacific Island communities through the arts, learning, and technology, and so forth. So she has a very good, firm grasp of life on the ground, on the community, in the community. So two very, very prominent um, uh, Micronesian scholars and knowledge makers and thinkers who are going to share with us some of their observations, some of the research which they have done, some of their experiences in terms of the changes in the U.S. policies in the Pacific, some of the implications of those, not only in relation to Guam, Micronesia in the North Pacific, but also the Pacific-wide space. So with those words, just before I ask them to do the presentation, just a couple of things. One is, please, if you have any questions, you send in your questions through the Q&A button in front of you, and then the questions will reach us, and then we can take your questions from there. You won't be able to, we can't see you. I'm sure you can see us. It's one of those virtual hide and seek systems which are developed nowadays to make sure that people feel comfortable in their private spaces and not to be seen by others. Otherwise, they will know what you look like. And so we'll do that, and then I will be monitoring the Q&A together with Holly, our administrator, and we will share your questions with the two presenters, and then we'll have discussions from then onwards. They will be given about 15 to 20 minutes to do the presentation, and then you'll have a good 20 to 25 minutes, depends very much on how much time we have towards the end to have some discussions. So without further ado, I would like to invite Ken to start with the presentation. Thank you very much.
All right. Since small seat, Steve. Half a day, everybody. My name's Ken, Gofigan Kuper from the island of Guam, over at the University of Guam. And today I'll be presenting really about, based on a paper that I wrote for the Pacific Regional Security Hub called The Labyrinth of Pacific Islands Policy Under Trump. So very excited to be here, and I hope anything I have to say is remotely useful. And if not, thank you for bearing with it anyway. All right. So, on March 27th of this year, U.S. Secretary of Defense, or Secretary of War now, as they call it, Pete Hegseth, visited Andersen Air Force Base on my home island of Guam. And during his short visit, Hegseth emphasized the island's strategic value. Regarding Guam and the CNMI, he said, these islands are the tip of America's sphere in the Pacific. Guam and CNMI are vital parts of America and central to our defense mission. I bring this up because I think this is a sort of premonition of what might be coming for the larger Pacific, right? So during Hegseth's tour, it was pretty clear that what the Trump administration wanted in this part of the world was to reestablish deterrence, offload regional security to allies, and then deepen strategic dependency on U.S.-affiliated Micronesia, which is what I'm going to be talking about a lot more today. Now, I think when it comes to trying to understand the Trump administration's Pacific Islands policy, there are two crucial challenges that we face. The first is that the Trump administration is rather new. It's still so the Asia-Pacific policy, Pacific Islands policy may be still unfolding and may not be completely clear for some time, even though the national security strategy that was just released does give us some direction. But larger than that, I want to talk about number two, which is, if we're talking about U.S. Pacific Islands policy, the critical question becomes, which Pacific Islands are you talking about, right? That is by far the larger question, because this question while relevant under Trump, is not new or unique. Every US presidential administration since the Asia Pacific pivot has had to struggle with this question, right? Guam, the Sinai, the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Republic of Palau maintain unique formalized relationships with the US, right? My home island of Guam has been a colony of the US since the end of the Spanish American War in 1898, and the US administered the other as part of the trust territory of the Pacific Islands after World War II. So we regularly interact with the US federal government, and the US federal government in return gets strategic denial in our part of the world, right? The rest of the Pacific Islands, however, have had historical colonial ties with other powers, and many of them are further from Asia, right? They have historical ties closer with the United Kingdom, closer to Australia, and New Zealand. So any assessment of Trump's specific policy then must begin with this fundamental distinction. And to put it simply, what the US does in Micronesia is not always what it does elsewhere in the Pacific Islands, right? And this, sometimes when we talk about the North-South Pacific divide, this is where you're going to really see it. So let's begin with the first thing. What will probably not change? Well, one thing that does not seem like it will change, apologies, is the disproportionate US military presence in US affiliated Micronesia. So what it looks like won't change is that hard power will be concentrated in our part of the world, particularly the two territories and the three freely associated states. So the increasing capacity of the PRC has led the US military to pivot to what they're calling distributed and dispersed operations, right? You can see this, for example, the US military has something called agile combat employment. The goal is to become operationally, strategically predictable, but technically unpredictable, right? So this is really predicated not on having just bases like Guam, but having what they're calling places, right? Which are these contingency locations that provide temporary support. And this reposturing was also reflected in why Hegseth was touring the region to gauge the commitment of US Indo-Pacific allies. So the US cannot be certain that their allies will allow the use of their countries during the conflict with China. This is where our part of the world, US affiliated Micronesia, comes into the fray. Because with the territories and the freely associated states, the US can more regularly rely on these islands for access without much political headache. In the world where the US has quote unquote changed from a liberator to a landlord seeking rent, end quote, these agreements in Micronesia provide a more reliable forward projection for the US. Both the first Trump administration and the Biden administration began the process of using other islands in Micronesia as contingency locations, right? So what I argue is that the US is shifting in Micronesia from strategic denial to reclaiming these places in what I'm calling strategic reclamation. And we can see this throughout, right? We have proposed projects in Yap, which is one of the four states of the Federated States of Micronesia, where the US is extending the runway at Yap International Airport to be used as a divert location because as it stands, the runway is too small to support military aircraft operations. We also have the divert airfield being built in the island of Tinian, which is part of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. And so what the US is doing is they're trying to reclaim airfields that they once used during World War II, right? That's like the major project that's going on across the Pacific. And these contingency sites reflect a wider effort to establish a distributed operational footprint across US affiliated Micronesia. They call this the Guam cluster, right? The Guam cluster referring to Guam, the CNMI, the freely associated states, even Wake Island can be considered part of the Guam cluster. And this is likely to remain during the second Trump administration. The picture I have here is some of the developments that are happening in Palau. In the country of Palau, you're really seeing developments happening in the island of Peleliu as well as the island of Angar, right? And in the most recent NDAA, which just passed the House for FY26, the US added around $500 million for improvements at Yap Airfield. So if it passes the Senate, then we'll see this become more clear. But quite frankly, this D2, what we're calling D2, distributed and dispersed operations, this concentration of hard power in Micronesia, due to the unreliability, the perceived unreliability of US allies in the case of conflict, that's going to be defining the security landscape of the North Pacific for quite a while, right? And so even Washington's foreign policy in the region may disproportionately affect U.S. affiliated Micronesia, but I think it's important to note that the rest of the islands are not immune. U.S. strategic movements may create ripple effects that are too large to be contained, right? Reaching shores across the Pacific. Again, the US and China are two giant elephants stomping in their field, right? And when two giant elephants are in a field, we are the grass, and the grass gets stumped on, right? No matter what elephant you root for. So that's just something for us to keep in mind, because potential kinetic conflict, or even the preparation for potential kinetic conflict involving the South China Sea or Taiwan, will inevitably involve Guam and the rest of the Northern Pacific. So it's not difficult to imagine conflict proliferating because major powers misperceive the intention, the resolve, or capability of the others, or because of the reputational costs of backing down from commitments. The Pacific must continue to pay close attention to Micronesia, as events in our subregion of the world could be a crystal ball for the trajectory of strategic competition. Now, with the national security strategy that was just released, when it came to Asia and our part of the world, what we saw was that the dominant theme was win the economic future and prevent military confrontation. But how did they plan on doing this? Well, there was a concentration of deterring military threats by having a military capable of denying aggression anywhere in the first island chain. Most related to the Northern Pacific, where we are, the national security strategy states we will also harden and strengthen our military presence in the Western Pacific, and the US will continue to have a vigilant posture in the Indo-Pacific, right? So even if the languages prevent military confrontation, again, the concentration of hard power and military installations in Micronesia seems to be what's unfolding with the Trump administration. If you'd like to track some of the Northern Pacific developments, the Pacific Center for Island Security has developed something called the Micronesia Security Monitor that uses data points to track maritime activities, military exercises, right? What are the different military bases? What are the places, foreign assistance? So you can see here, this is Malabar 25. We'll give you a description of it, key locations, who participated. We're also tracking the movement of Chinese research vessels in the region. So we think it'll be an important resource for all of you out there. And if you can help share the word and use the resource, here is a QR code you can scan. So it's the PCIS's Micronesia Security Monitor. So that's the first part of my presentation, is really trying to understand the hard power section. The next part is really related to soft power. Okay. And overall, I think there are signals that the Trump administration will continue to concentrate on hard power in Micronesia while sort of neglecting the soft power that it used to have, or the minimal remnants of what it had in the Pacific, right? We see here that Palau's president, who was a very strong supporter of the United States, even said regarding USAID, quote, "I hope that it is a retreat, reassess, and then come back stronger. It has been a bumpy road, cutting USAID and other activities, but I like to think positive." And the three areas that we see the decline of US sort of policy and the Pacific Islands priorities, what I'm calling these are misaligned security concerns. There are three main areas. Number one, obviously climate change, right? The future of US Pacific Islands policy may remain unclear, but just the position on climate change alone shows that there's a misalignment here. This is an existential threat for the Pacific. It remains one of the largest, greatest threats to our security, but it's become taboo within the Trump administration. If you look at the national security strategy, this is much as clear. Here's the direct quote from the national security strategy related to climate change. "We reject the disastrous climate change and net zero ideologies that have so greatly harmed Europe, threatened the United States, and subsidized our adversaries." This was in a portion of the national security strategy called energy dominance. So it's clear that when they even pulled out of the Paris Agreement, right? The US, this administration does not care or believe in climate change. Next, other forms of soft power. Okay. One worker in Fiji describing USAID and the withdrawal of this part of US soft power and assistance said that they face multifaceted challenges, particularly for development partners that rely on US aid to implement projects. So the dismantling of the United States Agency for International Development has been seen as an erosion of US soft power in the region. right? But we've also seen cuts, which I'm sure Mary can talk about more. We've seen cuts to other parts of U.S. soft power that were relevant in the Pacific, such as the East-West Center's Pacific Islands Development Program and the United States Institute of Peace, right? And here's what the NSS says, though. This is where it gets very contradictory. The national security strategy says that the United States maintains unrivaled soft power, that they exercise positive influence throughout the world. Clearly, that does not seem to be the case in the Pacific. I mean, read that second line there. We will be unapologetic about our country's past and present. Soft power that serves America's true national interests is effective only if we believe in our inherent greatness and decency. So already the misalignment of America first and Pacific Island security concerns, climate change, soft power, we're seeing it at the forefront. Here's another aspect, multilateralism, right? The Trump administration withdrew from multiple lateral agreements and institutions that the Pacific views as important. Not only the Paris Climate Accord, which Papua New Guinea's prime minister called totally irresponsible and morally wrong, but we've also seen President Trump sign orders withdrawing the US from the Human Rights Council, the World Health Organization, and overall calling for a review of US engagement in international forum. So this is part, the idea here for the United States and the Trump administration, at least in the way that they describe it in the national security strategy, is that they believe in sovereignty of states. And they even say that they want to fight against the sovereignty sapping incursions of the most intrusive transnational organizations. And the goal of the United States needs to be to prevent sovereignty erosion by regional and international organizations. So collectively, the signal being sent to the Pacific Islands is that the US is an unreliable partner right now. While congressional inertia may temper some executive overreach, the erosion of diplomatic institutions and regional goodwill occurs at the level of tone, emphasis, and perception, areas the executive branch controls. The signal sent to the Pacific is not to place too much faith in the promises of a US administration, as someone 4 years later can simply reverse that trajectory of progress. This inconsistency in US engagement reinforces a message to Pacific leaders that American partnership may be conditional, unreliable, and short-term. And in a region where relationships matter, the US seems to be going down a path that may do long-term damage to its long-term influence or relationships in the Pacific. As one Pacific diplomat remarked, the Pacific needs predictability in all our cooperation with everyone. But this leaves the pivotal question then. With the decline of soft power and diplomacy, who will be the US face in the Pacific? Robert Underwood, chairperson of our organization and former Guam delegate to US Congress, says that it may be the US military. I'll quote, "The American face in the islands used to include sympathetic civil servants, some eager entrepreneurs, and American migrants eager to find a new way of life in a calmer and stable environment. Today, the American face is likely to be in a military uniform, not an unfamiliar role, but again, almost entirely dominant in the relationships between the US and its territories, as well as the freely associated states," end quote. So if hard power has supplanted soft power as Washington's primary instrument in the Pacific, then the Department of War, the Department of Defense, may just become the most dominant US presence in the Pacific, or rather the remnants of US reliability in the region. And there is a caution to this, because if this is the case, then another signal being sent to the Pacific is that US military agreements are the way to get US engagement, which may bring economic development. To return to Micronesia, in the CNMI, US military presence in Tinian is often regarded as a significant economic driver. Local leaders have emphasized the positive economic impact of military projects, such as staying in hotels, renting vehicles, eating at restaurants. President Whips of Palau has also said that this provides economic activity because it builds up hotels, provides work, and overall is sustainable. So in this way, it seems that some in the Department of War hierarchy understand the ways that the military can exert influence in the Pacific Islands region. I want to give a quote by a former Department of Defense official who ran a Guam program office. He had a quote here that I think is really revelatory. Here it is. "I think it's going to be very positive regarding the Guam buildup. Because when other island communities start seeing what's happening in Guam, they will be attracted to the United States. US interests then will reach out into other island communities and influence them and bring them into the sphere of political, economic, and sometimes military influence throughout the whole world. Okay, end quote. So in this sense, US military developments in territories like Guam were not only disproportionately carrying the burden of US military interests in the Indo-Pacific, but also influence and attraction. Guam is then being used as a demonstration site, showing other islands that US military presence can be both a partner and an economic patron. But what can we learn from this if this is the trajectory of what the US wants to do in the Pacific? The first lesson that we need to learn is that Pacific Island leaders may feel the need to start framing the Pacific's critical issues, such as economic development or human security, into the language of geopolitical interests if they want anything from the US. And conversely, the US may continue to present military projects, such as those in Papua New Guinea, as a boon to economies and infrastructure. In this way, economic development, infrastructure, and technical assistance become the Trojan horse or the Trojan dove for US military presence in the islands. And security for the islands then becomes deeply entangled with speaking the language of military strategy. There's a real risk that Pacific development and security priorities will become fully subsumed into US, New Zealand, Australia strategic logic, and then securitize in a way that then constrain future agency. Even if the Pacific rightfully needs to maximize benefit in the current geopolitical moment, making military expansionism a long-term vehicle for critical issues should be seriously analyzed and debated. There's a real risk then that we need to consider what are the long-term effects of short-term leverage. And I think this presents an opportunity for the entire Pacific to think through these questions before it reaches their shores. The second lesson to learn is that even if the islands were to use a militarized or geopolitical framing, it's not even clear the Trump administration will listen or oblige. For example, in a place like Guam, where 27% of the island is currently occupied by the US military, we're also affected by cuts to federal programs for public services, education, disaster preparedness, and healthcare. A bunch of our local legislators have also written letters that pointed out the discrepancy between federal cuts and our ability to host US military expansionism. So from Guam, we learned that even if the dominant American face in the Pacific wears a uniform, it's unclear what it carries. Will it be support? Will it be stability? Or will it be strain? Guam's experience shows that military-driven economic development approaches are to develop more military capacity and not sustainable local development. So ultimately, the Trump administration's action in the Pacific so far seem to have a pattern. Military and strategic attention in the North Pacific, coupled with the withering of diplomatic, multilateral, and developmental presence in the rest. While the challenges between the US and Pacific did not start with the Trump administration, recent actions signal a regression. The US needs to be reminded that the Pacific is not without its choices. The Pacific Islands have agency. We are moving forward. The Pacific's trajectory is not derailed completely by American absence. Its diplomatic train continues to go down its own track with or without US passengers. If the American face in the Pacific remains exclusively in uniform, it may find fewer friends, less legitimacy, and a diminishing role in helping shape the region's future. The region will be respected. The Pacific must ride this wave and not let geopolitical and strategic considerations fracture its collective regional voice. The Pacific must return to core principles and hold steadfast despite who has power. In all, the Pacific must continue to choose, not wait to be chosen. Thank you. And if you want to read the paper that this originally came from, there it is. Thank you so much, Sizuz Masi.
Well, thanks so much, Kenneth, for the very interesting, very enriching, and of course, powerful presentation. And I'm sure would have provoked a lot of questions in terms of the shift from soft power to hard power and some of the implications, some of the lessons for Pacific Island states. And of course, those of you just join in later on, we have a Q&A function. If you have any questions, please feel free to send in your questions. So thanks so much for that, Ken. And I now invite Associate Professor Mary Hattori for her presentation. Please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Steve, Jose, for the invitation to be part of this event for our hosts at the PRSH, University of Canterbury Macmillan Brown Center for Pacific Studies, and to our admin technical support team in the background, Rebecca and Holly. Really appreciate all of the work you've done to get us to this point. And I want to thank everyone here joining us, and really want to thank you for your time and your attention. Before I go further, I want to say that all statements and thoughts expressed here are my own and do not reflect those of any organization with which I am associated, including the Pacific Islands Development Program, East-West Center, the University of Hawaii, and the Chaminade University. So I'm going to share my take on some of the U.S. policy changes, and just to give you some context, my perspective is coming as a recently retired director of the Pacific Islands Development Program. PIDP was founded in 1980 within the East-West Center, founded by a group of Pacific leaders to serve the people and nations of the Pacific. And since 1988 was a founding member of the Council of Regional Organizations of the Pacific. That is a group of 9 organizations that work to improve coordination, collaboration, and cooperation among various intergovernmental regional organizations working together to achieve the common goal of sustainable development in the Pacific, guided by the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent. We provide, crop agencies provide technical support as expertise, as well as services and goods that help advance the 2050 strategy. The January 2025 inauguration of a new president of the United States was a start of seismic shifts of foreign policy and domestic policy that impact the Pacific Islands region and Pacific Islanders in and outside the United States. So I'll focus on my areas of interest, development, and education, echoing some of what you heard from Dr. Kuper's presentation, but I think that the two of us will give you a nice complementary perspectives on these changes and their implications for all of us. Engagement with the region was evident and deepening during the previous U.S. administration. We see this in documents like the Indo-Pacific strategy, the priorities for a free, open, prosperous, and secure Indo-Pacific region. There were expansions of U.S. presence, not just military, but also diplomatic missions, new embassies, formalized the diplomatic relations with some islands, some groups such as the Cook Islands and Niue, as well as pledges of significant financial support in documents and agreements like the Tuna Treaty, the renegotiated treaties with the Compact of Free Association Nations, Palau, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia, as well as some financial commitments for infrastructure and climate adaptation initiatives. There were more frequent and direct communication and multilateralism. And as Dr. Kuper mentioned, priorities have shifted. There is a more unilateral approach, prioritizing the U.S. government's own national strategic interests, prioritizing its own influence in the region, seeking to diminish influence of competitors. The shift has been seen as detrimental to the advancement of Pacific regional priorities, especially in the areas of development, environment, and social policies. These shifts signal a diminishing role of the U.S. in partnerships that support Pacific resilience, environmental stewardship, and values around things like gender equity. We have seen since January executive orders banning diversity, equity, and inclusion. Gender equality and social inclusion is a priority throughout the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent. We have seen immigration restrictions, travel restrictions, barriers to access for visas for travel, work, study, detentions, and deportations, as well as reductions in research and other grants, development grants, a lot of academic and educational support for Pacific Islanders. And so today I want to share some of the impacts and implications of these shifting priorities. And towards the end of this brief presentation, hone in on some of the challenges as well as opportunities in the areas of education and research, two key development areas for the Pacific. As the World Bank's Changing Wealth of Nations report notes, development is about building human capital. Increases in human capital translate to increases in real wealth per capita. Education, academic or on-the-job training, these are traditional pathways for the region to develop human capital. Study and training in the U.S., scholarships, short-term U.S.-based experiential programs that provide islanders with vocational, research, and leadership development opportunities. These were vital and effective ways to grow human capital in the Pacific. I'm going to share just a few of the projects that I've been associated with. The stories of these projects and their impacts due to changes in U.S. policy are echoed in many, many other projects across the region. So I'm just going to share these three projects that I was directly affiliated with. The National Science Foundation awarded $10 million to a consortium of institutions led by Chaminade University. That's a private Catholic university in Honolulu. That consortium included the University of Hawaii, John A. Burns School of Medicine, the Pacific Islands Development Program, and the Texas Advanced Computing Center. Our focus was on building capacity and workforce for data science analytics, and capacity across Hawaii and the U.S. affiliated Pacific region. That grant was terminated earlier this year, ending scholarships, staff positions, professional development, and research activities in the area of data science for many Pacific Islander students across the U.S. affiliated Pacific. They also provided seats for Pacific Islanders outside the U.S. API who happened to be studying in Hawaii. So we were building capacity in data science across the region. As Dr. Kuper mentioned, the U.S. Agency for International Development was one of the first agencies to face cuts. The Pacific Community and a consortium of organizations, including East-West Center, had a project that was terminated. It was called Project Governance, Promoting Just, Engaged, Civic-Minded, and Transparent Governance. The goal of that was to strengthen local communities, foster consensus, inclusion, inspire ownership, and draw on local understandings of governance in the Pacific. For PIDP, the outcomes of termination of that assistance included laying off valued staff, canceling scholarship support for graduate students from Pacific Islands who were in Hawaii, termination of the Pacific Islands Financial Investigative Reporting Mentorship Program, as well as support for professional development programs and mentoring of emerging and current Pacific Islander journalists across the region. And the other project I'll mention is that several multi-year, multi-million-dollar grants from the Institute for Education Sciences and the Department of Education were canceled. Some were subsequently partially restored, but the disruptions were significant. There were disruptions in educational research and capacity building, primarily across the U.S.-affiliated Pacific, Hawaii, American Samoa, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, Palau, and the Marshall Islands. Again, for all of these, not only did people lose their jobs, but any capacity building efforts and research efforts to improve educational outcomes for Pacific Islanders are definitely negatively impacted. There are numerous threats that are present, numerous negative implications for just the handful of those projects that I've mentioned. Observations that I want to share that are of primary concern to me, and I hope also concern to other educators who are present and those of you associated with educational institutions, those of you who are involved in educational policy making, both in the U.S. and beyond. We have severely reduced educational opportunities for Pacific Islanders studying in the U.S. and for those in the U.S. affiliated Pacific. The anti-DEI executive orders have made it impossible to sustain any gender equity programs in vocational education and in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I worry as a female scholar, my original area of study was technology, educational technology. We see so few women in that field, and whatever progress we made, I fear has been really diminished. And I worry about future generations of scholars from Pacific Islander communities and and female scholars. Opportunities for research, gender equity in the area of research has also been negatively impacted. Freedom for academic growth, critical thinking in our young scholars, exploration in critical thinking and articulating our ideas, whether it's in classrooms, in writing, in informal and formal spaces, has also been threatened. Collaboration across communities of scholars, of indigenous experts, has also been impacted. The continued inclusion of indigenous scientific knowledge in academia and research is under threat. And not to mention, just to bring it down to the very human level, trauma to families separated by detention and deportation is real. Some of the first deportations of minors occurred on Hawaii Island among school children who were deported to countries not their countries of origin and separated from their parents. We have had Pacific Islanders detained after flights into Honolulu, suspected of carrying drugs with no evidence, some even taken to x-rays at hospitals, without evidence detained in the Federal Detention Center in Honolulu with the general population. Citizens of two Kofa nations were detained in the Guantanamo Bay detention camp in Cuba. These are very real threats, that have serious implications. Foreign relations, as Dr. Kuper noted, for Pacific Islanders is about relationship. It's about relationship. All of these stories impact the relationship that the United States has with Pacific Islanders. So what are the opportunities among these threats? I think for all of us, it's an opportunity for us to raise awareness. These are difficult things for us to talk about. It is very difficult to talk about detention of our family members, the loss of valued staff members, losses of jobs, losses of scholarships, students having to quit college because of lost graduate assistantships or research assistantships. These are very, very difficult topics for us to speak about. And so we often don't talk about it at all. And people outside this country don't realize what's happening to our Pacific Islander students and scholars and researchers. So I think learning more, having more opportunities to raise awareness is important. I implore all of you, especially those outside of the United States, to help counteract the isolating outcomes of these policy shifts. We in America, those of Pacific Islander heritage and of other heritages, are not, we're under threat. Academic freedom, freedom of expression, safe spaces to gather, those are all very rare commodities. We can, however, share these things and find safety outside of our country and in gatherings like this that are hosted by universities outside of America. I would invite all of you to think about ways you can partner with Pacific Islanders, partner with US-based institutions that are led by and are supportive of Pacific Islanders, create opportunities like this, virtual as well as physical, for safe gatherings, discussions, and exploration of ideas. I think about the wonderful growth that we saw in the face of the global pandemic, the growth of gatherings like this, webinars that enabled all of us to come together to have these difficult discussions, to share support groups for female academics, support groups for Pacific researchers. I think those are all great ways that everyone can help without a lot of resources, and create opportunities for study, research, and training for under-resourced groups that are no longer supported in the United States because of the anti-DEI executive orders. And for those of you in the US, I would invite you to hold your organizations and your governments accountable. And as I close, I want to, as Dr. Kenneth Kuper did, remind all of us, especially those of you in this room, in this webinar, who work for Pacific people. You work in organizations that study us, that produce research about us, that advance goals for the benefit of Pacific people. I want to remind you of the things that we hold dear, this shared identity, the concept of the Blue Pacific, first officially articulated in 2017, and then further articulated through Blue Pacific Principles a couple years later. This emphasizes, among other things, regional priorities, a partnership approach, collective outcomes, and impact. Our Pacific values, ideals, and aspirations have not and will not, should not, as Dr. Kuper said, should not change in the face of shifting policies of so-called allies and partner countries. If you aspire to or assert that you and your organizations are working for the Pacific Islands, you should be advancing the goals of the region as stated in documents like these: 2050 strategy, for the Blue Pacific Continent, the Revitalized Pacific Leaders Gender Equality Declaration, and many other documents that have come through regional meetings. Too often, outsiders have the best intentions, but their work is not guided by the voices of Pacific Islanders in the region. Finally, on Guam, we have a saying, "Iirentia nalala I espirituta." Our heritage gives life to our spirit. I know that some of my students are on this call, colleagues, fellow Pacific Islander academics, policymakers. To all of you, I say, let us hold fast to our timeless values and traditions, which have made us resilient in the face of changing colonizers, global upheavals, and shifting priorities of foreign governments who claim to be our partners. In these challenging times that are fraught with uncertainty, let your heritage give life to your spirit. Hold on to the certainty, that in the resilience and strength of our Indigenous communities, we have permanence in our cultures, our heritage, our spirit, and the future of the Blue Pacific continent. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, Mary. It's a great way to finish off the message of hope from the challenges to opportunities. And certainly, I think there's a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of hope in terms of how we move forward from here, as you mentioned, in terms of the traditional Pacific cosmology and the way in which opportunities and hope is part of the pathway for the future. So, yeah, no, there's so much to talk about here. There's so much to discuss. And like I mentioned earlier, we'll go by the questions which have been streaming in like tsunamis across the Pacific. We're having a difficult time trying to choose which ones, but I'll try and collapse some of them together. Some of them are similar. Some have been sent to me earlier, and some are coming through. So probably let's start off with some of the early ones which came through. Perhaps the first one for Ken is an issue of I suppose the external economic or political pressures by the U.S. on Pacific Island states, and how would they be able to? How can leaders and policymakers, perhaps the Pacific Island Forum, how can they balance that with the local sovereignty and regional interest, so that just to make sure that the regional interests and sovereignty of the different island states are supreme and not overshadowed by external pressures. So there's a question for Ken, and the question for Mary is, how can educational and professional state institutions, which are not too aligned with the U.S. and have not been disadvantaged by the withdrawal of U.S. aid, be able to perhaps help as part of the looking for alternatives, fallback positions, and alternatives, creative alternatives, looking forward to what can be done in the future. So those are just two questions to start with. So Kenneth first, and then Mary.
Thank you, Steve. So just to get it right, you're asking what can be done to balance sort of national interests with regional interests?
With the external interests of the U.S., for instance, and you're talking about the shift towards hard power and the softening of the soft power,
yeah.
To put it that way, and how that might trickle down in terms of putting pressure on Pacific Island states, particularly military pressure, and how can Pacific Island states respond in ways to make sure that their sovereign interests are always being kept, within the kept supreme.
Yeah, that's a great one. I think, just on a little bit of bad news, right? The bad news is that we are seeing a recent Pacific Dynamics special issue on changing geopolitics in Oceania right? I think one theme that is very clear, what we're seeing all across the Pacific, is this proliferation of bilateral security agreements. Anna Powell's wrote about it very well. Highly recommend going to read about that. But the whole idea of trying to preserve who you are and your wishes, your national interests in the face of geopolitical pressures is very difficult, simply because if there is a need, such as climate mobility, and I'm a larger power that's saying, okay, we'll give you a pathway, but we get a de facto security veto over any agreements, right, that deal with security, then you're put between a rock and a hard place. And so there is no easy answer. But I think the way to navigate that forward is to strategically pause, right? Don't sign things too quickly. Really think through these agreements. And then another thing is that's the strength of what should be regionalism, right? The whole notion of power, small state influence is really predicated on three things: sort of your natural sources of power, your derivative power, and your collective power. And I think if we're talking about a region that is being pressed bilaterally, then the collective power needs to be emphasized a little bit more, because that's the playbook, right? Is go with you on a bilateral basis. And then the regional sort of vision becomes in the form of just like discourse or communiques. And so there's no easy answer, but I think regionalism is a start, not an end, but it's definitely a start.
Well, yeah, thank you so much, Kenneth. Can I maybe just a question in relation to that? You may notice, you will remember that in 2022, the Pacific Island leaders went to Washington, the invitation of Biden, and he signed the U.S. Pacific Agreement, and $800 million were promised. It hasn't come in yet. It may never will. So in some ways, that has been seen by some people as Pacific leaders always so easy to, if you like, to leverage and manipulate to move towards the eight donors' interests. And so, somebody just commented on that through the email. But anyway, so maybe Mary can respond to the question.
Hi, Steve. Thank you so much. Now, was the question for American-based institutions or just in general, any institutions that are not unconstrained by these?
Well, you're talking about some of the ways in which the withdrawal of US aid has impacted on things like diversity, things like inclusion, and things to do with minority specific and so forth. So the question was to do with what can institutions, whether universities or governments which did not, we were not impacted by US aid withdrawal, to help support as a fallback position, as a way to make sure that some of those issues are addressed.
Thank you. Thank you. I think this is a wonderful opportunity for international universities to open their doors, and many have, to American students. But let's not forget the Pacific Islander students who are facing great difficulty in sustaining their scholarship in the United States. There's an opportunity there. In particular, the fields of data science, technology, engineering, and math, which saw huge cuts, educational research. So, trying to identify the gaps that exist, because there are students who were in place doing some amazing research projects that were cut short. And so I think if we can help them reach the finish line, if we can help junior faculty who are on their way to tenure and just lost their grants and their research support, we can keep the momentum going and hopefully help people recover all of that wonderful talent and expertise to the benefit of the receiving organization. So I think there are lots of opportunities there. We do see in some universities new programs, new DEI programs in non-American universities. And so this is, they are reaching out to people with that expertise in America, and their institutions are benefiting greatly because they can leverage all of that existing talent that is being unused and underappreciated in this country. So I think we can, there are a lot of there's a lot of existing talent, existing opportunities, models, processes, and people out there. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for that, Mary. There's a question here. Maybe I'll collapse two questions together into one because they're very well connected. The question is, recently, the US has been interested in deep sea mining. So the president signed the executive order on deep sea mining, and that will have a lot of implications on the Pacific in terms of American corporations coming to do deep sea mining exploration in the Pacific. In the Cook Islands, they call it harvesting. Just go and harvest what's there in the seabed. And the other question is to do with, apart from the North Pacific military interests of the US, also recently the US and Australia have engaged with Papua New Guinea in terms of a security arrangement, the focus in the South Pacific. So the question has to do with, so what is your view on this? Is it a concern? Is it a natural development, how things have been unfolding? And what are some of the consequences of those? The deep sea mining on one hand, and also the security agreement with Papua New Guinea.
I can start with the just briefly on Papua New Guinea, right? Again, it's we're seeing this proliferation, as I mentioned, right? Falapili, Nauru, Australia agreement, how do you say it? Puk Puk, right? But I think with the US PNG, it's not a coincidence that, the US, amidst all the USAID cuts, right? The US announced like $400 million for a fuel storage facility in Papua New Guinea, and then said that collectively there will be hundreds more millions of dollars to be spent on helping to improve infrastructure as it relates to like base access. And so again, that is PNG is sort of the example of what I'm calling the export of that military security development model to the rest of the Pacific that we're seeing in Micronesia. I think PNG is one way to the US's form of doing that. So I think PNG is going to be a major player in that regard. What happens with MONUS, we need to definitely track that. And the intersection between US and Australia in that regard is also very interesting because down south, it's mainly Australia military. Up north, it's mainly the US military. And so PNG is sort of in this intermediary place, which may be good to watch. Deep sea mining, the Pacific is very, well, there are divisions rather within the Pacific regarding deep sea mining. But from a territory perspective, we do see proposals to explore deep sea mining near the Marianas Trench, right near Guam and Saipan, near Guam and the CNMI. But they only wanted to give our governors and our community like a 30-day comment period. And so that's the thing with a lot of these developments. That's another thing that I'll go back to the former question, Steve, is like, how do you make sure that your interests are secured? Well, as you ask for more time, like I said, a strategic pause, because quite frankly, a lot of proposals happen at accelerated speed, and then you're given such a short window of review, right? And so that is happening not only in the military stuff, but also the deep sea mining proposals for Guam and the CNMI. And then there are also the issues of exclusive economic zones, right? Even though Guam is a non-self-governing territory that's supposed to control, obviously the US makes claims on the EEZ. So will we benefit economically from that? That's another question. So it's a very, to put it simply, it's now becoming a major issue and something that's being talked about a lot more in Guam than it was 2, 3 months ago.
So I had to unmute myself. Well, thanks so much for that, Ken. Yeah, there's another question here from someone who's based in Washington. Yeah, there is a view in DC that the Trump administration may elect to pursue statehood for Guam and CNMI. Well, there's a particular, school of thought. I'm not sure who it's coming from, but you might want to comment on that. So certainly there may have been some rumors swirling around. Juan Babauta, who's a strong advocate for U.S. statehood for CNMI, spoke to Trump in Oval Office. You may have heard about that some months ago. So this is probably where that view is coming from. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think Governor Babalta is on our advisory council, and he definitely sees some of the deficiencies in the CNMI's current status. But for Guam, a lot of the proposals are very much linked to geopolitics, right? So some of the proposals, not only in the United States but in Guam, some of the folks that are thinking about this believe that making Guam a state will do two things. Number one, it will show China that the United States is here to stay in the Pacific. It's sort of an indivisible, integral part of the United States. And then the Guam perspective is like we won't get some in the Guam perspective, right? We won't get quote unquote abandoned if we're a state. I don't support statehood for Guam. I think Guam entering into a more sovereign political status is the correct and appropriate direction for the island. But I cannot speak for the CNMI.
Well, thanks so much for that, Ken. Yeah, so just a couple more questions which have been coming through. I suppose I'm just trying to unravel some of these questions as well, just to see that. So the debate on Guam itself, one of the early questions which came in relation to the U.S. involvement. How far does the debate go in terms of what the citizens themselves want to see? Like in any country, there may have been divergent positions. Some may be beneficiaries of things, which have been happening, and of course, there's opposition to that. So, how's the debate going, and what are some of the manifestations of that?
I could speak a little bit on that and then pass it on to Mary. But I think in Guam we do have 3 separate task forces related to statehood, independence, and free association. But I think the larger issue is, we were following international law and trying to make so that the native inhabitants of Guam were the ones to vote on the future political status of Guam, but the U.S. court said that was unconstitutional, and we had to pretty much open up the vote for everybody. And while we were doing this, trying to fight for indigenous justice, we were actually called racist and segregationists. Conservative media labeled Guam as the Jim Crow of the Pacific because of our efforts to try to make the vote be for the colonized people of Guam. And so that's sort of the largest thing that's going on right now in relationship to the self-determination and political status issue.
Well, thanks so much for that, Kenneth. There are a few more questions coming. Sorry for putting you under a lot of pressure for both of you. There's a question there. Well, I suppose it's for you, actually. Under successful application of the Trump corollary strategic denial of non-hemispheric competitors from Latin America, we could foresee China redirecting some of its financial capacities from the Western Hemisphere to the Pacific. If yes, what could be the implications, including counter moves of other powers in the Pacific region? So it's basically a question that's to do with the shifts in, I suppose, in the power direction of influence towards the Chinese, and what would the reaction be when that happens?
See, that's Mana who wrote that. And that's a great question, Mana. I'm gonna need more time to think about that one and talk to you separately, man. Yeah, that's a good question, though. I think if you read the new national security strategy, which obviously you have, one thing is very clear is that it is, the emphasis on great power competition has been severely reduced, right? Um, since 2017, right, for example. But the emphasis on economy is huge, right? And so I'm thinking that, what are the divergences in policies and thoughts that we can leverage appropriately? Um, that's a larger question, but I'm gonna have to think about the implications of counter moves of other powers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Mary might want to add on to that.
I don't want to add on to that, but I do want to speak to the earlier questions about Guam and
Oh, yeah, sure. Yes.
statehood. And just want to note that it's really about self-determination and not what the Trump administration wants for us, but what do the people of Guam and the CNMI want for themselves. And I do think we need to remember that we Pacific Islanders, when we consider what we want, we will look at the United States track record and its relationships with all of its Pacific peoples since before 1898. And that I think, what is the U.S. track record with regards to Native people and Pacific people? That's to me much more important than what does the Trump administration want for us. And then in terms of deep sea mining, I think we do need to keep in mind that while the Pacific is divided, one of the factors for all of us is this inherent connection between environment and identity. And I think that when we think about impacts of exploration, potential exploitation of natural resources, those from outside the Pacific need to remember that it's not just about land and ocean, it's about identity. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mary. I think this is very, very significant. Identity is very, very much part of defining people, and people are very much central to anything, whether it's to do with security, human security, geopolitics, and so forth. Perhaps there's a question here. Maybe it's the last question, which is coming through, and for both speakers. So it appears that there may be, well, this is to do with the Pacific Island Forum. If anyone from the Pacific Island Forum is listening today, is a role in trying to mediate between the security issues of North Pacific and the South Pacific, because they appear to be different in terms of the historical as well as the strategic evolution and dynamics over the years. So as Ken has talked about the strategic underpinnings of the U.S. relationship with the North Pacific, and certainly in the South Pacific, with Australia and New Zealand, and the US too is involved, but not so much as intensively as in the North Pacific. So one can actually identify some of the differences, whether the differences in terms of a degree or in terms of type of security focus. So that's the question here. And what can the Pacific Island Forum do to mediate between the two different narratives, two different dynamics of security? So perhaps, yeah, it's a question for both of you.
Okay. I think some of the largest issues, even if our own populations, like on the community levels, right, may not necessarily perceive it that way. I think the biggest divergence is that in the North Pacific, particularly the US affiliated parts of Micronesia, the texture of our security, the future of our security landscape will be really contoured by this combination. Number one, we share the human security concerns of the South Pacific, like climate change, like economic development. However, we also are at the forefront of what are called like traditional security concerns, right? And we do not have the luxury of saying that geopolitics is a distraction in our part of the world, right? We have to be an expert. We have to be experts. We have to have solutions. We have to be thinking about both these things at one time, right? Both our hands are full. Traditional security, human security concerns, right? Both matter. At the level of existential threat, right? You have climate change, and then you have, like in the case of Guam, being bombed, right? And so that's the hard part about being from this part of the Pacific Islands. And I think the Pacific Islands Forum, right? They have the security outlook that they do in conjunction, that they did conjunction with the Fusion Center. And I saw that there was a section on geopolitics, but I think what could be done is to increase the expertise regarding geopolitics in the North Pacific, include more space for its discussion, and not ever be under the belief that like an over concentration on understanding military strategy and traditional security is a distraction from other things. Because in fact, the geopolitical environment will texture the decision-making calculus of states in our part of the world.
Well, thanks so much for that, Ken. Mary, any last words?
I think the Pacific Islands Forum there's so much potential to be a very powerful force and a powerful voice that unifies the region. And we have to set aside the criterion of sovereignty for the sake of true Pacific regionalism and welcome all of our Pacific Island peoples into the fold and to really do as much and be as inclusive as possible, regardless of national affiliation and sovereignty. I think that would be a great service for the forum to provide and to continue to push for recognition as the true apex of Pacific Island diplomacy.
Well, thanks so much, Mary. Thanks so much. It's so great to finish with a hopeful message in terms of how we can move forward, in terms of the role of the Pacific Island Forum here, and certainly the role of the various institutions, universities, and states in the Pacific in relation to how we can support those who have been disadvantaged by some of the policy shifts of the US. So thank you so much for both of you. Mary and Ken, it's been very, very exciting. It's been very, very provocative. It's been very, very enriching and very enlightening indeed, listening to an analysis of the shifts in the US policy in the Pacific, particularly in the North Pacific, where a lot of focus of US foreign policy in the Pacific is being framed. So not just the geopolitics, the implications on militarization, on the indigenous people, on education, and on the migration process. And the withdrawal of US aid has had a lot of impact as well. And indeed, the shift from soft power to hard power and leaving a vacuum there, which I suppose China would be very willing to fit into. And suddenly, geopolitics in the Pacific is getting more and more complex over the years. We're going to see things beginning to unfold in different ways. So a lot of things are unpredictable. Certain things can be predictable long term. There are a lot of things which are unpredictable, and we've seen a lot of those unfolding. certainly in the area of deep sea mining, in climate change is huge for the Pacific Island states and how it's been impacted by the shift in the U.S. policy and multilateralism, which the Pacific governments have relied on for a long time for support, is now being challenged as well. So we have a lot to think about and we have a lot to discuss. And these have been subjects of discussion in the last few months and a couple of years or so. So certainly it was good that we have moments of hope coming out in terms of what we can do as a way of adaptation and survival in the midst of all the challenges. Some of those have been raised by both Mary and Ken. So thank you so much for your presentations. And I'm not sure what time it is, in Hawaii or in Guam at the moment. It's 5:22 here in New Zealand, and it's actually time to go home. So all of you who've been very patient and have enjoyed the discussion, wherever you are in the United States, I notice that some people are based in Washington, in Canberra, and various parts of the Pacific, and in New Zealand, and in Asia, Europe, wherever you are. So good morning, good night, good evening, a good day, whatever the time is. So thank you so much. You will hear more from us in terms of our seminar series. We had one last year, and we are going to have more in the future. The Pacific Regional Security Hub has been quite busy in doing a lot of security-related research and engagement in the Pacific. And the two presenters are also visiting fellows of the hub, of the Security Hub. So thanks so much once again for Kenneth and for Mary. And thank you also to Rebecca, Holly, and Joseph for the background support and putting together this marvelous virtual exercise. And just to say that we are real humans and not AI beings. So some of you have seen us, have spoken to us. So these are just images of the real people rather than AI, as we've come to believe everything which appears on screen is supposed to be AI driven. So thanks so much, and vinaka vakalevu, and so see you next time. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.